Hello, students. This is Dr. Lyons, and in Chapter 19, we're going to talk about population ecology. So we're going to talk about populations such as what you see here, right? So here's a population of bison that could care less about this Prius. This is maybe my favorite picture I've ever taken of a Prius because these bison were basically as big as the Prius, and they were just standing in the road and they could care less about this car. So if you ever have a chance to get out to Yellowstone National Park, which is where I took this picture, I highly recommend it because you can see some populations of really cool animals, such as these bison. So what we're going to cover in this chapter is populations and we're going to talk about the ecology that kind of affects them. So first of all, we should talk about what exactly a population is. So population includes individuals that are in the same species and that are in the same area. And so for instance, what you see here, all of these cute little fish, these are what are known as humbug damselfish. And all of these damselfish are of the same species and they're all living in the same area. They're living in the same coral reef, right? So they are a population. What about this picture here? Does this look like a population? The answer should be yes, right? So these are all what are known as jacks. And these jacks are all of the same species and they're all living in the same area, right? So they're living in a coral reef. Okay, how about this picture? Is this a population? Right, so look really closely. The answer is no, because what you see here is this is a snapper. This is what's known as a grunt. This is a butterfly fish. Behind here is a porcupine fish. This is a parrotfish. These fishes are what are known as sergeant majors. Right, so we have a bunch of different types of fish. Right, so they're all in the same area, but they're different fish. So this is what would be known as a community. And so this is what we're going to talk about in the next chapter, in chapter 20. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what population ecologists study. Right, so the main thing that they're interested in are population dynamics. And so let's think about that word dynamic a little bit. Right, so dynamic is essentially the opposite of stasis. Right, to be dynamic is to be something that changes, that moves over time, that moves around, that evolves over time. And populations, they change over time. And so a lot of what population ecologists study is why that happens. Right, so they study why, for instance, a population might grow or decline. Right, why is it that a population gets bigger or gets smaller over time? And what are the biotic or abiotic factors that might affect that? And so the things that population ecologists the specific things that they tend to study tends to be population size, right? So just how many individuals there are in a population. And so what we could do here in this picture is you could, go to this reef and make an estimate of how many individuals are there of that population. Of course, that's easier said than done, but that is something that population ecologists do. Population ecologists also are oftentimes look at age structure, right? They look to see how many individuals in a population are, say, really big and really old, and how many individuals are very small and very young, because that can give you a little bit of an indication of whether a population is growing or shrinking. If a population is dominated mostly by older individuals, then that would tend to indicate that the population is decreasing in size. Whereas if you have a population that is mostly dominated by very, very young individuals, that would tend to indicate that the population is increasing in size. Kind of two good examples of this is Japan and the United States, right? So in the United States, our population is increasing, right? So every day there are more and more Americans than there was the year before, the day before. And so if you were to look at our average, age, it would be less than that of Japan, where in Japan the population of humans is actually decreasing. And you would find that the average age of a person from Japan is greater than that of the average age of a person from the United States. Finally, one other thing that population ecologists often look at is the density of individuals. So the size of a population can be really important, but the density of individuals is oftentimes more important. And by density, I mean the number of individuals in a given area, of a given size. So one thing that me and my friends are doing here is we're looking at the number of corals on the seafloor in a given area. So if a coral reef has just one coral in it, in that coral reef is, say, just one square foot, then that's a pretty good amount of corals for such a small coral reef. But if there's just one coral in an area the size of a square mile, now that's far fewer corals, and that would not be a very good number of corals for a whole coral reef. So the density of individuals is really, really important for population ecologists. Okay, why population ecology is important is because it's used to study some really important things, such as harvested organisms and how to increase them over time. Right, so of the things that we harvest from the wild, which is for the most part mainly things that are from the sea, uh, population ecology is used to make sure that those populations of things, such as this thing here, the Atlantic striped bass, population ecology theory is used to keep those populations healthy, or at least it's attempted to keep those populations healthy. It doesn't always work out so great because it's oftentimes very hard to estimate just how many fish there are in the sea. But population ecology is still used for managing species that we harvest from the ocean. We can use population ecology principles to control pests that we find around us, like insects and things like that. And we can also use population ecology theory to save populations that are threatened with extinction. And so that kind of applies to this harvested organism, the striped bass. So striped bass, up until the early to mid 70s, striped bass were doing pretty well. But then in the early 70s, about the same time that disco craze was taking over America, the striped bass started to dwindle. I'm not sure if they started to dwindle because they hated disco so much, uh, but what's more likely the case is that they decreased because we were catching too many of them and because the waterways in which they reproduce were getting polluted. So they decreased almost to zero, but using some good population ecology ideas, a striped bass were basically saved from extinction, right? So regulations were put in place on how many striped bass people could catch, and their populations rebounded. So that now, myself and my family, this is something that we do occasionally. We go out and we catch striped bass. Okay, so let's talk about some kind of general principles behind population ecology. And a lot of what population ecology is interested in is in the growth of populations, right? So how they get bigger and bigger over time, right? And so a really important question here is whether or not a population can grow exponentially forever. What I mean by exponential is that each year you add more individuals than you added in the previous year, right? So like say for instance, during from month 10 to month 11, you increase by say 100 in say 50 individuals of rabbits. And then from month 11 to month 12, you increase by 200 individual rabbits. And then from month 12 to month 13, you might increase by 300 individual rabbits, right? So during each time period, the number of individuals you add is greater than the number of individuals you added the year before or the month before or whatever, right? And so what you see is this curve that is getting steeper and steeper, right? So the slope of this curve is getting more and more steep as you go along, right? And so why can't this go on forever? Right? Why can't you have just rabbits, growing in their population exponentially, indefinitely? Right? So the reason is resources in space. And space itself is kind of a resource. So a resource is any sort of thing that a living organism needs in order to survive, right? So rabbits, they need a little space to make a little burrow in the ground in that they can live inside, and they need grass that they can eat and grow from. Of course, if the earth just became completely overrun with rabbits, then all the grass would disappear and all the available space for rabbits to make burrows in would go away. So that would then limit the growth of those rabbits, right? You couldn't have an earth that every square foot of the earth was covered with rabbits. That would just never work. So eventually, a population will stop growing exponentially. That is kind of an interesting thing when you think about it in the context of humans, right? So this is what our population looks like going from 8,000 BC up, pretty close to present, right? So our population is still growing exponentially, right? So each year, more humans are born than were born the year before. And at the time that this graph was made, up till 2000 AD, the population of humans was a little bit over 6 billion. Now, 20 years later, we're a little bit over 7 billion, right? And each year we're adding more humans than we had the year before. So obviously, us humans, we can't keep growing in our population exponentially forever. Eventually, we're going to have to either, find another planet that we can live on, or many other planets to live on, or our population growth is going to have to stop. We're going to have to reach a level where we just can't get any higher. So exponential growth just isn't sustainable in the long run. What eventually happens is that exponential growth then gives way to logistic growth. So logistic growth follows what's known as a S curve, where if you kind of squint, the red line looks a little bit like an S. So like this S in sustainable, it looks a little bit like that. And what you see here are the number of male fur seals in thousands of individuals. So you see at the beginning, it's growing in an exponential way, so very low numbers. The reason why the numbers were so low is because we were hunting for fur seals up until the early 1900s. But then we stopped doing that, or we stopped doing that for the most part. There are, still some places where people hunt seals, but for the most part, we're not doing that anymore. And so first seals started to increase in abundance. They're growing exponentially, but they couldn't just keep doing that forever. So they started to kind of level off. They started to get to a maximum level. And why they got to a maximum level and couldn't keep growing is because there's only so many resources for them, right? There's only so many fish that they can eat. And there's only so much space on beaches that they can breed their pups on. So there are things in the environment, there are resources that will limit, how big a population can get. So exponential growth doesn't continue forever. It always gives way then to logistic growth. So how population grows is like I was saying before, it's affected by resources, right? So resources put kind of a limit on how big a population can get. And then kind of related to that are three things that we're going to cover in a little more detail. So we'll talk a little bit more about competition, we'll talk a little bit about density dependence, and we'll talk a little bit about carrying capacity of populations. Right, so competition, what it is it describes the struggle for resources. Because there's only so much food out there for all individuals. And when that food gets in limited abundance, there's a struggle to get that food to survive. And so any sort of resource that an organism relies upon, it will oftentimes be competing for that resource. So when things are in different species and competing for a shared resource, that's what's known as interspecific competition with a ER in the middle of it. So what you see here is a coral reef, and there are various types of coral, so different coral species that are living on that reef. And those different coral species are competing for a place on the seafloor to grow. So this is interspecific competition where different species are competing for space on the seafloor to grow. What you see here is a bunch of what are known as Christmas tree worms. and they are competing for also for space on the seafloor where they can live. But because all of these Christmas tree worms are all of the same species, this is what's known as intraspecific competition with a RA in the middle of it. So interspecific is between different species, intraspecific is within the same species. Okay, so then something that's kind of related to that is what's known as density dependence. And so this gets at how the density of individuals in a population has an effect on individuals in that population. So a really good example of this comes from a study that my wife did a few years ago. So my wife studied lionfish for her PhD dissertation, and she did a really nice experiment where she took different reefs and she put different numbers of lionfish on those reefs, and then looked at what happened to the growth of those lionfish. Right, so kind of a nice thing about working with coral reef fish is that in general, coral reef fish, when you put them on a reef, they will stay there on that reef because the coral reef fish doesn't want to swim over a broad patch of say, sand where there's nothing to hide inside of. So you can do experiments where you can take a fish and put it on a small coral reef, and in general, it will stay there. And so what my wife did is she went out to reefs that were about the size of a table, so not particularly big reefs. And on one reef, she put just one lionfish. On another reef, she put two lionfish. On another reef, she put 4 and 7 and 10 and 12. So she had a gradient of reefs, some of which had a lot of lionfish and some of which had very few lionfish. And then she measured those lionfish at the beginning of the experiment, and then she measured them again a couple months later and looked to see, how much they had grown. And so we have the density of lionfish on this horizontal axis and the growth of lionfish in millimeters of length per day on the vertical axis. And what she found was that when lionfish were in really low densities, they grew the most. When they were in high densities, they grew the least. And the reason has to do with competition, right? So on a reef where there's a lot of lionfish, where you have a lot of buddies around you, you're all competing for a small amount of food. And if you get less food because you have more competitors for that food, that means that you're not going to grow nearly as much. Whereas if you're just one lonely lionfish and you have one reef all to yourself, that means that you can grow a lot more because you're competing with less other lionfish for that food. Think about it this way. If you went into an In-N-Out burger and you were the only customer in that In-N-Out burger, you could get fat very quickly because you'd have all of those In-N-Out burgers all to yourself. Whereas if you go into an In-N-Out burger and it's packed with customers, it's going to be harder for you to get fat because all of those people in the In-N-Out burger are going to be competing with you for those delicious In-N-Out burgers. So essentially, the more individuals there are competing for a resource, the less that they are going to grow. So the density of individuals has an effect on how much they grow. And density does have effects on other, aspects of the life of a living thing. Think about reproduction, for instance. If you are one of the lionfish living in this area where there's 11 other lionfish around you, that means you have a lot of, potential mates in order to reproduce with. But if you're that one lonely lionfish, you may be growing really well, but you don't have any buddies around you to reproduce with. So density also has an effect on reproduction in individuals. So then one last thing I want to talk about in relation to the growth of a population is a principle known as the carrying capacity. So the resources that are in the environment, they will put a limit on how big a population can get. And the limit is what's known as the carrying capacity. Right, so this is the graph that I showed you a little while ago of fur seals. And so the carrying capacity for those fur seals is somewhere around 9,500 individuals, right? The environment doesn't have any more capacity for any more individuals, right? They might overshoot their capacity a little bit, but they're in general going to stay right around that capacity. So they can't get too great. They can't get to be too many individuals. It's kind of the same as like the capacity of a room, right? You couldn't take a classroom and just keep adding more and more students into the classroom because the room itself only has so much capacity. So that's what that kind of describes. Okay, so then I want to take what we just learned a little bit about competition and about carrying capacity and density dependence, and let's think a little bit about what things might cause a population to increase in size, and what might cause a population to decrease in size. So there's kind of two really important things here. So the things here are resources. Well, there's kind of three important things. There's resources, there's competitors, and there's enemies. So if you have an increase in the amount of resources that are available to you, that means that that population is going to increase in size. If you have a decrease in the amount of resources available to you, say you're a finch on the Galapagos Islands, and let's say there's a drought, so that now there's very few seeds around, and so the resource has diminished. That means that the population is going to decrease in size. If a competitor gets added to an area, now again you have less resource available to you because that competitor is going to take away some of that resource from you. That's going to decrease the population. And then enemies include things like predators and parasites and pathogens, right? So when predators are really abundant, that's gonna cause a population of prey to decrease. So let's think about that in the context of this graph here. So this is one of the classic graphs of population ecology. So what this is showing is over time the amount of snowshoe hares and the amount of lynxes. And so you can see the relationship between those two right here. So this is a snowshoe hare and that is a lynx. So the lynx is obviously a predator and the snowshoe hare is the prey. And so there are some important trends that I want you to see here, right? So first of all, how most people would describe the overall trend here is that there's like increases and decreases and increases and decreases, right? So the snowshoe hares and the lynx, they tend to go up and down and up and down. So the populations increase and then they crash, and then they increase and then crash, then increase and crash over and over again. So that's one important thing that I want you to notice in this graph. Another really important thing is the timing of these increases and the timing of the crashes, right? So for instance, take a look at this period right here. So you see that the snowshoe hare increases in abundance, and then the lynx follows after it. Because as the hare gets more abundant, that means that there's more resource for the lynx. So then the lynx increases. But then the snowshoe hare crashes, and now the resource of the lynx is gone. So then the lynx crashes in abundance. And then the hare increases, the lynx increases after it, the hare crashes, and then the lynx crashes. So the lynx kind of follows whatever it is that the snowshoe hare is doing, which makes sense because the snowshoe hare is the prey of the lynx. So the cycles that you see going on here, they're caused mainly by shortages in food in the wintertime. So during really bad winters when there's not a lot of food for the hares, that means that the hares really diminish in numbers, which causes then the lynx to decrease in numbers. When there's really good availability of food, that means that the hares are going to increase, which then means that the lynx are going to increase. So the hares they kind of limit just how many lynxes can be in the population. And probably too there is also some aspect of the lynxes having an effect on the hares, right? So when there's a lot of lynxes around, there's going to be the hares are going to start to decrease in abundance because the lynxes are eating the hares. So that's kind of the how ecologists kind of describe the situation. Where there are these cycles, and the cycles are because of the food that's available to the hares. The cycles we see in the lynxes are due to the cycles of the hares, and the lynxes themselves then also affect the hares. Okay, so one last thing I want to talk about in the context of population ecology is what's known as life history. And so we're going to use this to kind of link population ecology to evolution. So life history describes the traits of an organism that have a really big effect on how they reproduce and consequently on their survival. So some of these traits might include things that affect the population growth, right? So how a species reproduces has a really big effect on how it's going to grow. And in the sort of traits that a population or species has for its survival, it's also going to have a big effect on how that population grows. So some of the key life history traits include how fast individuals grow, right? And by that, I mean how fast do they get from being small to being fully grown, to being an adult. The faster individuals grow to adulthood, the faster a population can grow from very small numbers to very large numbers, right? So think about like a bacteria, right? So a bacteria can get to be its full size, just in a matter of maybe minutes or hours, whereas a whale will take, as much as a couple of decades to get up to be its full size, which is why bacteria's populations can increase very rapidly, whereas whale populations increase very slowly. The age at which a species will reproduce first, that has a big effect on life history, right? So again, something like a bacteria, they can reproduce after, say, 20 minutes, whereas a whale, or a human for that matter, can only reproduce once they're up to teenage years, which means that bacteria populations can grow really quickly, whereas human and whale populations grow much more slowly. The frequency that a species reproduces, that also has a big effect on population growth. So species that reproduce frequently, every day, every week, every year, those are things those are things whose populations can increase very rapidly. Whereas like a female whale can only have a calf every like say 2, 3, 4, 5 years, a whale population can't increase very quickly because the number of new individuals being produced is a very slow rate. The number of offspring that a population has that the individual has can have a big effect on how populations grow. With something like say a fish that produces, tons and tons and tons of eggs, a fish population can oftentimes grow more rapidly than say a whale population. Whereas whales typically only have one calf, per time that they have calves. Finally, parental care is really important here, right? So some species give lots of parental care, so like humans, for instance, a lot of people, live with their parents, into their teenage years, 20s, 30s, 40s, whatever, no judgment. A lot of people get a lot of parental care. Whereas something like a bacteria, they don't really give a whole lot of parental care to their babies. So that can have a big effect on how populations grow. So when we think of all of these different traits, we tend to think of species as having either what's known as an opportunistic life history strategy or having an equilibrial life history strategy. So these are the terms that your book uses. If you are looking up kind of supplemental information on this, you will see reference to what is known as R-selected and K-selected species. So R-selected are the opportunistic ones, K-selected are the equilibrial ones. And so an opportunistic life history strategy is one where you grow very quickly, you reproduce at a very young age, you reproduce very, very frequently. When you reproduce, you make tons and tons of offspring, but those offspring are given very little or zero parental care. So an opportunistic thing is something like a bacteria, where they can take an opportunity and they can use it to grow in their population size very, very rapidly. So if you go to the store and get some raw, ground beef, and you put it out on the counter and you forget about it, a population of bacteria can take that opportunity and grow very, very rapidly. Because individuals grow quickly, they reproduce very young, they produce a lot of offspring, and they don't need to give a lot of parental care. Whereas an equilibrial life history strategy, Those include things more like whales, right? So whales grow very slowly, they reproduce very late in life, they don't produce a lot of offspring every time they reproduce, but they do give each of those offspring a lot of care. So in general, what you see is that things that have opportunistic life history strategies, their populations will increase very rapidly and then crash when they exhaust the resource, and then increase rapidly and then crash when they exhaust the resource. Whereas things that are more equilibrial, their populations tend to be a little bit more stable, right? So you don't see as much of them increasing and crashing and increasing and crashing quite as much. Okay, and so this is really more of what I just talked about. So whales have an equilibrial strategy, bacteria have more of an opportunistic strategy. Okay, so one kind of last important thing I want to talk about in the context of life history traits are trade-offs. So first of all, let's just think about what a trade-off means in general, right? So it essentially means taking one thing, but at the expense of losing another. So it's getting one thing by losing another thing, right? You can't have everything in life. Sometimes you just have to choose between one thing and another thing, right? So if you, if you I don't know. Say you only have a limited amount of money, and say you can either use that money to buy a car or go on vacation. You can't do both. You probably can't go on vacation and buy a car. You have to give up something in order to get another thing, right? So that is a trade-off. And there are trade-offs with life history traits. So I'll talk about these two fish in a minute. But if you just think about it, you can only do so much in your life, right? So let's think about the life history traits of number of offspring produced and amount of parental care given. So if you have a lot of offspring, you can only give so much parental care to each one, right? So parental care and number of offspring are kind of offset from each other. They're trade-offs with each other. You can't both have a crap ton of offspring and give the same parental care, to each one, right? So which is why, in general, humans don't have a lot of offspring because we give a lot of parental care to our offspring, and we can only give so much parental care, because children require a huge amount of work, right? All my friends that have kids, they basically have no lives because they are just giving so much energy into raising those kids, because we give so much parental care. Whereas if you're something like, I don't know, like a fish, where you don't give any parental care to your offspring, you can have, way, way more offspring in that circumstance. However, few of those offspring are going to survive to be adults because parental care, ensures that something has a better chance of making it to adulthood. So there's a trade-off there. And one of my favorite types of trade-off is what goes on between these two fish known as a rainbow trout and a steelhead. So what you see here is a rainbow trout, and what you see here is a steelhead. And believe it or not, the two of them are actually the same species, right? So we call them different things, but they're actually the same species. So what rainbow trout do is they stay in rivers. And inside of rivers, it's relatively safe, unless, of course, Dr. Lyons comes along and then I might, if I'm lucky, catch a rainbow trout and then have fish tacos for dinner. But in general, rivers are safe places for fish because there's not a lot of predators in those rivers. But the trade-off is that there's not a lot of food in those rivers. So this rainbow trout has spent its whole life eating small insects, which is why even though this rainbow trout is a relatively large trout, it's never going to get that big because it's eating insects. So it can't get very big, and as a result, it can only produce so many eggs. So that is the strategy that this trout is using. So it is picking safety over size. Whereas steelhead, like rainbow trouts, are born in rivers. But what they do is they migrate down to the ocean. And so the ocean is risky. There's a lot of big predators in an ocean that can eat a small rainbow trout when it migrates out to the ocean and becomes a steelhead. However, in the ocean, there's a lot of food, right? So this steelhead didn't get this big by eating insects. it has spent a few years out in the ocean where it's been eating, crabs and other crustaceans and small fishes. So it's been eating larger things, which allows it to get larger. So when the steelhead then comes back up into a river to spawn, it can produce a lot more eggs because it's gotten a lot bigger, right? So what steelhead do is they pick size and number of eggs over risk, right? So they expose themselves to risk with the trade-off of being able to get really big and producing a lot of eggs. Whereas trout, like I was saying, they pick safety over size and eggs. So they pick being safe in life with the expense of not ever being able to get big and not being able to produce many eggs. So there's a trade-off here between these two different strategies. Okay, so that's all I've got to tell you about population ecology. What we'll do in the next chapter is we'll talk about the ecology of communities. So we'll talk about the ecology of things that are in different species from each other.